Before getting to the main theme of this video, the main things I want to talk about, I'm just going to read a piece from the Times yesterday, March 18th, 2024, about the latest situation with the war in Gaza and Israel. I don't know what title this conflict is going to have. The October 2023 war, 2023-24 Gaza war, the Israel-Gaza war. There could be many different titles it has, because this is only the latest escalation. It's a very big escalation, but only the latest escalation in, of course, a series of wars between Israel and the Palestinians. But it is the most serious, deadliest since, in living memory. I think it's surpassed now the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War of 1973 in terms of its casualties. And I'll just briefly say that even if people doubt the 30,000 figure put out by the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry, I think it's clear that it's very costly. Some sources are saying it's actually the deadliest conflict of the 21st century in terms of the casualty rate. It's hard to know if that's true or not. There have been other conflicts. Like, I remember the closing weeks of the Sri Lankan civil war in 2009. There were figures of 20,000 being killed in those closing weeks of that conflict. And there's been other examples of intense flare-ups over a short period of time. But I think it is clear that the casualty rate is horrendous. Okay, so bear with me. I'm just going to read this out and then add a few thoughts to the situation. Netanyahu to spare Rafah's war refugees. The reports by Gabriel Weiniger in Tel Aviv, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. The Israeli Prime Minister promised not to invade the city that has become home to most of Gaza's displaced, while civilians remain locked in place. Our goal in eliminating the remaining terrorist battalions in Rafah goes hand in hand with enabling the civilian population to leave Rafah. It's not something that we will do while keeping the population locked in place, Benjamin Netanyahu said in a joint press conference in Jerusalem with Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor. Netanyahu pledged to forge ahead with the operation during his weekly cabinet meeting, saying Israel must operate in Rafah to eliminate Hamas and release 134 hostages held since the October 7th assault. Rafah, near the Egyptian border, is sheltering 1.5 million Palestinians from other parts of Gaza. Israel says it has approved plans for an invasion that includes evacuating civilians. Scholz repeated his opposition to the offensive, adding to UN and US warnings that a full-scale military operation could be catastrophic. Scholz suggested a longer-lasting ceasefire, saying that the number of civilian casualties have grown to be extremely high, many would argue much too high. The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says more than 31,400 people have been killed in the Israeli assault. Ceasefire talks brokered by the US, Egypt and Qatar are due to resume with an Israeli delegation led by David Barnea, the director of Mossad, going to Doha today. Meanwhile, Netanyahu appeared on CNN where he refused to commit himself to holding elections until the military concluded the war against Hamas. He also labelled a speech made by Chuck Schumer as totally inappropriate after the US Senate Majority Leader called on him to step down and labelled him an obstacle to peace. Now, Schumer's a long-standing supporter of Israel, and I think we're going to see more of this. I think we're going to see more figures who I think are getting increasingly uneasy with what's happening, despite their support of Israel, feeling obliged to speak out. And I think actually this compromises our position. You know, we fund Israel, we're a supporter of Israel. The longer this goes on, and the longer it's deemed that Israel is crossing a line, then the more we'll be seen as complicit in it, and the harder it will be, frankly, to lecture on human rights. If some totalitarian state kills civilians in a war zone, they would just point and say, well, you funded Israel, which killed innocent Palestinians. I think that it's, you know, if you try sitting on the fence with this conflict, if you try saying, I understand both sides, there's no winners, because it's so tribalized and so emotive, you know, that it's just more than any other conflict. This one really, really polarizes opinion. But I've noticed that there is an increasing polarization of Israel. I am familiar, there's some of the sort of forums I'm on where there are still people who just blindly support everything Israel does. I cannot align myself with that. At the same time, I certainly wouldn't fully endorse the pro-Palestinian movement so long as it has clear Hamas sympathisers in its midst. Now, I want to be clear about this because I've mentioned this in the context of debates around protests. It is not my position that everyone who supports Palestinians is a Hamas sympathiser. I certainly don't believe that. I think there's a lot of normal people who are understandably concerned about the situation. Um, I personally know people involved in that, so I think it would be wrong to label all pro-Palestinians as pro-Hamas. But I do think there is a concerning number of them that don't seem to recognise what Hamas does is absolutely terrorist. I mean, the deliberate targeting of non-combatants in the way they did on October the 7th is repugnant. And when people vilify Israel, the only point I would make here is this isn't something that's just come out of thin air. They often say, the war didn't begin on October the 7th. Well, they're right, but by the same token, Israel didn't just act, out of nothing. There was a context there, which was a huge scale terrorist attack. Hundreds of Israelis killed in the same day, in fact, over 1,000. So I think it's utterly unreasonable to expect Israel to have done nothing. Any Israeli prime minister would have been under immense pressure to act on that. It just happens to be that Netanyahu's a hawk and he happens to be in office. Already a controversial figure in Israeli politics before this began. Um, but there's warnings now of an impending famine. We saw the situation recently. It was called the Flower Massacre. What exactly happened is hard to tell. I think it probably was more likely a stampede. I think Israeli troops did open fire, and maybe there was some deaths from that. But it does counter the Israeli claim that there's no humanitarian crisis, regardless of what happens in those sort of incidents. There was another one where an aid parcel apparently crushed 5 people to death. This is what's happening, and people are dying every single day. It is a grim, grim situation. And whilst I think Hamas is definitely a hindrance to peace and a hindrance to aid efforts, I don't think Israel's been entirely helpful either because, they are checking everything that's coming in, and that's fine. They want to make sure that there isn't weapons involved, but really stopping medicine, stopping food supplies, that's morally indefensible. I think some of the things Israel has done in hospitals is morally indefensible. I mean, there was footage emerged a while back where they held non-combatants for hours and hours, people who clearly were not Hamas fighters, unarmed. That's the sort of images the world is seeing. And this is why Israel is getting increasingly unpopular, dare I say even hated in quite a number of quarters. Um, I have defended Israel on occasion and I will continue to do so if I think the criticism is misplaced. But right now, I do think what's happening is there are hardliners in Netanyahu's cabinet and Netanyahu himself who are basically looking at this as, well, we're in a fight for survival, so we'll do as we please. And we'll tell our Western allies that we're making provisions for civilians. But the fact of the matter is, Israel has told people to go to so-called safe areas, then they've bombed it. Their bombing campaign has flattened the place. And the situation in Rafah, it's good that Israel's talking about humanitarian evacuation, but they need to really lay out how that's going to happen, because in the current circumstances, where are those people supposed to go? It may be that Israel and Egypt can take advantage of their relatively good relations to have some sort of compromise with a civilian corridor. I don't know, but um, the thing is, the calls for the ceasefire, Israel's argument is it just gives Hamas time to rebuild their arms and so on, and that's technically true. But what Israel needs to understand is the world is seeing Palestinians dying in their thousands. At the beginning of this war, the Israeli casualties were a lot higher, but that soon went back to the situation of Palestinian casualties being a lot higher. Why does that matter? It's about perception. Frankly, most of the world right now sees Israel as the villain. I don't think that's entirely fair, but there are things that Israel is doing that are hard to justify in any context. I don't think there's any excuse for degrading non-combatants. Yes, they have to check people, but when it's clear that they're not combatants, they should let them go. You know, degrading people in that way is appalling. And I do think there are trigger-happy IDF troops. I do think there have been examples of IDF troops looting and doing as they please. On a much smaller scale, it's a bit like Northern Ireland in the early 70s, where you had British soldiers. And, a lot of them were young soldiers that were in a difficult position. And, it's easy for me to say there's thousands of kilometres away, there's young IDF troops whose lives are on the line out there, let's not forget. But there's no excuse for abusing civilians. I was looking at a list of casualties in the Troubles yesterday, and there were a lot of civilians caught in crossfire or caught in the hands of the British forces. And yes, a lot killed by the IRA as well, including many Catholic civilians. Now, that was on a much smaller scale than what's happening here. I mean, 432 people died in Northern Ireland in 1972. That's like a day in Gaza. So it's an appalling situation. Maybe not a day, but a few days. Regardless, it's a horrendous situation, and I think Israel really, really needs to reflect on this because, I mean, Netanyahu apparently reacted with anger to Western criticism. Well, the Israelis need to bear in mind that they have very little support left. So they shouldn't polarize the people who are supporting them, i.e. Western countries. It's not going to go down well. And I think over time there's going to be some sort of, not compromise, but some sort of, I don't know, there might be a situation where Western powers say, look, we're no longer going to associate ourselves with this, we're no longer going to fund you. And I actually think that there may come a point where the British government may have to say, we're putting a pause in arming Israel, or a pause in funding Israel, because we don't want to be associated with this increasing situation. Of course, it's not the first time we've been complicit. Saudi Arabia, we've armed Saudi Arabia. Saudi's war in Yemen. So whilst I'm staunchly pro-West, I'm not blind to where the West could be caught out in accusations of hypocrisy. We need to be careful about that. But I am very uneasy and frankly depressed about what's happening out there, and I'm far detached from it. I don't know what it would be like psychologically for an aid worker, or even a journalist, or anyone who's right in the thick of it. Um, the IDF, are very defensive, as you'd expect them to be, as are Israeli politicians. But saying there's no humanitarian crisis, no one believes it because it isn't the case. So I think Israel really needs to reflect on how this is going down. It's all very well saying, well, we're in a fight for survival, we're going to do what we can. But Israel needs support. It's a small country. So if they want to continue having support, they're going to have to prove that they're not basically in a policy of collective punishment, because that's what's starting to look like. And that will fuel the claims of genocide. I'm not sure that at this point fits a legal definition, because genocide by definition means deliberately trying to wipe an entire people out. But the number of people that are dying, and pending famine, the degradation of non-combatants, all those things are unacceptable. And I do think there should be increasing criticism from Western allies. Um, but I'm not prepared to totally throw myself in the pro-Palestinian cause, because I do think there are some elements there that are not helpful, not just in their support for Hamas, but the way they absolutely refuse to see any of Israel's perspectives either. I think that's wrong. Israel does have a right to defend itself, but I do think it's gone too far with this.